Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of In the Heart of the Sea, the new Ron Howard movie that's based on a true story which inspired the famous novel Moby Dick. So, I figured that In the Heart of the Sea would be a good movie. I'd hoped that it would even be a great one. However, I was never very interested in the project because I am fairly familiar with the true story and knew that if it was faithful to the historical events, it probably would not translate very well onto film. Probably would make a hell of a novel, but in movies, it would just climax too early and then bore you for the remainder of its running time. You see, in Moby Dick, the climax is when the whale sinks the ship, and what precedes that is them hunting Moby Dick. However, in the actual event, it goes on for a lot longer. The whale would sink the ship about the halfway point. Maybe if they want to push it, they could have that happen around the beginning of the third act. However, the tale of survival ultimately comes afterwards, where they're stranded in the ocean, suffering from dehydration, starvation, tensions are really beginning to mount, and that's hard to pull off in film, especially if it climaxes so early. But I figured, I'm sure Ron Howard will make it work. He is a good director, and even if I'm not always interested in what's going on, I'd like to think that the acting would be exceptional, that there would be ways for them to make this a compelling tale of survival. And then the reviews came in, and I was surprised how negative the feedback was. At best, people were indifferent, but almost everyone was unanimously disappointed with it. And now that I've seen the film, I didn't like it very much. And what's sad is it's technically a well-done movie. The direction was solid, the cinematography was pretty good, the special effects were really good. I had no issue with the music or the editing. The acting was strong, the dialogue was fine, and yet it never really made any kind of connection to me. And I spent a lot of time thinking about why, and I came to the conclusion that In the Heart of the Sea is too ambitious for its own good, and it ultimately collapses under its own weight. It has so many characters, but isn't entirely sure which one it wants to focus on, and it ultimately tries to balance out an ensemble piece, but in the long run, it's hard to really care about anyone because of this. Nobody is properly fleshed out, and even when they develop, you don't really see that development happen off screen. It has to tell us that they are being developed. Now, you might think that obviously Chris Hemsworth, who plays the first mate, that he's the main character. And technically that is true. However, is it really his story? Because the film starts off with the author of Moby Dick. He's interviewing a survivor of this event, and the survivor is the young guy, the kid in the flashbacks. So you figure it's about one of them. However, for the most part, the kid, he's just kind of there throughout the majority of the movie. He barely has an impact in what's actually happening. He's just watching it all unfold. So that's not a very compelling protagonist. And the author of Moby Dick wasn't there. So you don't really feel any tension involving his fate, so you can't really call him the main character either. And yet, it keeps telling us that these characters are changing throughout the course of the film. The guy the author of Moby Dick, explains his insecurities, which seem rather feeble compared to some of the shit that the guy he's interviewing has gone through. And when he explains, how he's changed after hearing this story, I just didn't really buy it. And when it comes to Brendan Gleeson, I think that's his name, his character, the flashbacks needed to end with implications of what he's going to become as an adult. You needed to see more, you know, he needs to be more traumatized. You need to see that guilt, and maybe even imply that he's about to become an alcoholic. But nah, he seemed oddly well adjusted by the time the flashbacks end. So suddenly that jump just kind of loses all dramatic impact. I would have figured that these were two very different characters, except they're not supposed to be. And with Chris Hemsworth, he has his own story arc, but it's still very flimsy. I mean, really the only conflict he has, internal conflict that is he starts to feel remorse about killing whales. And I figure, of course, they're going to force in the anti-whaling message, which I don't blame them for, but it was too underdeveloped to really matter. There's just one scene where he looks kind of sad after he kills one, and then when he has this final confrontation with, the main antagonist whale, it just, I was like, that was a thing. There's some sort of strange obsession there. It was just, once again, so underdeveloped. They're trying to make this character into this movie's Ahab, and yet there weren't any indications that he was that before. And when the whale just kind of backs away, it felt weird. Like maybe there was something missing, that maybe it was left on the editing room floor, where that would have made this dynamic stand out a lot more. And it's at the same time, in the flashbacks, even then, it's trying to balance between Chris Hemsworth and the captain has his own character arc where he starts off as somebody who doesn't really want to be there but feels that he has to be, and he works hard, but he's insecure and inexperienced, and his pride sometimes gets the better of him. And yet, once again, when he starts to change, it comes out of nowhere. You don't really see the build up to it, so it just robs that subplot of any of its drama, really. And, at first, these guys do not get along. They're constantly bickering. And then they start suddenly getting along really well. And it was kind of like, why did they need that? That just was an odd payoff to that tension between them. And I was disappointed in certain things. Like, in real life, the first mate actually made kind of an error after the ship sank. The captain wanted to go to these islands, but the first mate refused because he believed there were cannibals there. And it's actually believed now that the captain was correct. If they had gone to these islands, they probably all would have survived. And I think that would have been interesting, seeing, this green captain who's obviously out of his depth. He suddenly has the moment where, yeah, he's right, but unfortunately, because of his inexperience, nobody really listens to him. And Chris Hemsworth, who for the most part the film has portrayed as in the right throughout this entire time, would have suddenly been confronted with, a major mistake. And then maybe that would have made the characters' journeys more meaningful. But they don't include that real life issue. So Chris Hemsworth just seems kind of like a Mary Sue. And the captain is just, sort of there. So that was a shame. But the acting was good all around. I thought Chris Hemsworth did an excellent job. He obviously loses a lot of weight throughout the duration of the film, and it makes it rather uncomfortable at times. But still, the film just never had all the pieces, all sorts of interesting parts of potential, but didn't really know how to utilize these characters to where they do make a connection to the audience. Now, what I think could have salvaged this, though, is if the film just played up the spectacle a lot more. I found the visuals to be very dreary and unpleasant to look at, which you could argue is the point, because this film is supposed to be bleak. It's supposed to be dark. It's not the swashbuckling adventure that Moby Dick was. But because I thought it kind of fumbled with the drama and the character arcs, that just sort of lost all of its intended goals. Uh, so the bleakness didn't really mean anything in the long run, other than making the movie even more boring to sit through. If it had a lot more color to it, where the cinematography could really stand out, such, Life of Pi was an excellent example of a film that had a lot of color, which made what would have probably been a plotting narrative much more interesting. And granted, very different stories, so you can't just do that exact same style. But if there was more color here, I think I would have been able to make an attachment to the film, even if it was only through the spectacle. But because of its very muted color scheme, I didn't find the film very interesting to look at, and the substance wasn't really very interesting to experience as well. So, like I said, Moby Dick is a technically well-made movie. It's just it didn't make an attachment to me or most people who saw it, so I can't recommend it. If you do want to see it, I'd say just wait till it comes out on DVD. But it is rather a disappointing film, regardless of its technical accomplishments, because you just expect so much more from a kind of movie like that, especially to get released during December, which is where a lot of the Oscar contenders come out. So yeah, that's how I feel. I did not do a written review of this, but I did do written reviews of The Mummy's Shroud, a Hammer horror film, and House, a 1986 horror comedy. So please read those. I'm going to start working on my TLC review now. So stay tuned for that. Follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I shall see you guys later.